The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood. There were formerly a king and queen who were so sorry that they had no children, so sorry that it could not be expressed. They went to all the waters in the world. Vows, pilgrimages, and ways were tried, but all to no purpose. At last, however, the queen had a daughter. There was a very fine christening, and the princess had for her godmothers all the fairies they could find in the whole kingdom. They found 7. That every one of them might give her a gift, as was a custom of fairies in these days. By this means the princess had all the perfections imaginable. After the ceremony of the christening was over, all the company returned to the king's palace, where was prepared a great feast for the fairies. There was placed before every one of them a magnificent cover with a case of massive gold, wherein were a spoon, knife, and fork, all of pure gold set with diamonds and rubies. But as they were sitting down at the table, they saw come into the hall a very old fairy, whom they had not invited, because it was above 50 years since it had been out of a certain tower, and she was believed to have been dead or enchanted. The king ordered her a cover, but could not furnish her with a case of gold as the others, because they had only made 7 for the 7 fairies. The old fairy fancied she was slighted, and muttered some threats between her teeth. One of the young fairies who sat by her overheard how she grumbled, and judging that she might give the little princess some unlucky gift, went as soon as they rose from the table and hid herself behind the hangings, that she might speak last and repair, as much as she could, the evil that the old fairy might intend. In the meanwhile, all the fairies began to give their gifts to the princess. The youngest gave her the gift that she should be the most beautiful person in the world. The next, that she should have the wit of an angel. The third, that she would have a wonderful grace in everything she did. The fourth, that she would dance perfectly well. The fifth, that she would sing like a nightingale. And the sixth, that she should play all kinds of music with utmost perfection. The old fairy's turn coming next, with a head shaking more in spite than age, she said the princess should have her hand pierced by a spindle and die of the wound. This terrible gift made the whole company tremble, and everybody fell crying. At this very instant the young fairy came out from behind the hangings and spake these words aloud. Assure yourselves, O king and queen, that your daughter shall not die of this disaster. It is true I have no power to undo entirely what my elder has done. The princess shall indeed pierce her hand with a spindle, but instead of dying, she shall only fall into a profound sleep, which shall last 100 years, at the expiration of which a king's son shall come and awake her. The king, to avoid the misfortune foretold by the old fairy, caused immediately a proclamation to be made, wherein everybody was forbidden, on pain of death, to spin with a distaff and spindle, or to have such any spindle at their houses. About 15 or 16 years later, the king and queen, having been to one of the houses of pleasure, the young princess happened one day to divert herself in running up and down the palace. When going up from one apartment to another, she came into a little room at the top of the tower, where a good old woman alone was spinning with her spindle. The good woman had never heard the king's proclamation against spindles. "What are you doing there, goody?" said the princess. "I am spinning, my pretty child," said the old woman, who did not know who she was. "Ah," said the princess, "this is very pretty. How do you do it? Give to me that I may see if I can do it." She had no sooner taken it into her hand when, whether being very hasty at it or somewhat unhandy, or to the degree that the fairy had so ordained it. It ran into her hand, and she fell down in a swoon. The good woman, not knowing what very well to do in this affair, cried out for help. Because people came in from every quarter in great numbers and threw water upon the princess's face, unlaced her and stuck her with the palms of her hands, and rubbed her temples with hungry water, but nothing would bring her to herself. Now the king, who had come up to the noise, bethought himself of the prediction of the fairies, and judging very well this must necessarily come to pass, since the fairies had said it, caused the princess to be carried into the finest apartment in the palace, and to be laid upon a bed all embroidered with gold and silver. One would have taken her for a little angel, she was so very beautiful, for her swooning had not diminished one bit of her complexion. Her cheeks were carnation, her lips were coral. Indeed, her eyes were shut, but she was heard to breathe softly, which satisfied those about her that she was not dead. The king commanded that they should not disturb her, but let her sleep quietly till her hour of awakening was to come. The good fairy who had saved her life by condemning her to sleep 100 years was in the kingdom of Matakin, 12,000 leagues off, when this accident befell the princess, but she was instantly informed of it by a little dwarf who had boots of 7 leagues. That is, boots which at a single tread over 7 leagues on the ground he could stride. The fairy came away immediately, and she arrived about an hour after in a fiery chariot drawn by dragons. The king handed her out to the chariot and approved everything he had done, but she had the very foresight. She thought when the princess should awaken she might not know what to do with herself, being all alone in the old palace. And this is what she did. She touched with her wand everything in the palace, except the king and queen. Governesses, maids of honor, ladies of the bedchamber, gentlemen, officers, stewards, cooks, undercooks, scullions, guards with their beefeaters, pages, and footmen. She likewise touched all the horses which were in the stables, and pads as well as others, the great dogs in the outward court, and pretty little Mopsy, too, the princess's little spaniel, which lay by her on her bed. Immediately upon touching them, they all fell asleep, that they might not awake before their mistress, and that they might be ready to wait upon her when she wanted them. The very spits of the fires, as full as they could hold the partridges and pheasants, did fall asleep also. All this was done in a moment. Fairies are not long in doing their business. Now the king and queen, having kissed their dear child without waking her, went out of the palace and put forth a proclamation that nobody should dare to come near it. This, however, was not necessary, for in a quarter of an hour's time there grew up all around the park such a vast number of trees, great and small, bushes and brambles, twining one within another, that neither man nor beast could pass through, so that nothing could be seen but the very top of the towers of the palace, and that, too, not unless it was a good way off. Nobody doubted the fairy gave Wren an extraordinary sample of her arts, that the princess, while she continued sleeping, might have nothing to fear from any curious people. When 100 years were gone, and past the son of a king there reigning, and who was of another family from that of the sleeping princess, being hunting in that side of the country, asked what those towers were which he saw in the middle of the great thick wood. Everyone answered according to what they had heard. Some said, that was a ruinous old castle haunted by spirits. Others, that the sorcerers and witches of the country kept there in the Sabbath on night's meeting. One common opinion was that an ogre lived there, that he carved all the little children he could catch, that he might eat them up at his leisure, without anybody being able to follow him, and having himself only the power to pass through the wood. The prince was at a stand, not knowing which to believe, when a very good countryman spoke to him of it. "May it please your royal highness, it is now about 50 years since I heard from my father, who heard from my grandfather that there was in the castle a princess, the most beautiful was ever seen, that she must sleep there 100 years, and should be wakened by a king's son, for whom she was reserved." The young prince was all on fire at these words, believing, without weighing the matter, that he could put an end to this rare adventure, and pushed on by love and honor, he resolved that moment to look into it. Scarce had he advanced towards the woods, when all the great trees and the bushes and brambles gave way of themselves to let him through. He walked up to the castle, which he saw at the end of a large avenue, which he went into, and what a little surprise was that he saw none of the people could follow him. It became the trees closed again, and as soon as he passed through them. However, he did not cease from continuing his way. A young and amorous prince is always valiant. He came into a spacious open courtyard, where everything he saw might have frozen the most fearless person in horror. There reigned over all a most frightful silence. The image of death everywhere showed itself, and there was nothing to be seen but stretched out bodies of men and animals, all seeming to be dead. He, however, very well knew, by the ruby faces and pimpled noses of the beef-eaters, that they were only asleep, and their goblets, wherein still standing some drops of wine, showed plainly that they fell asleep at their cups. Then he crossed the court paved with marble, and went up the stairs, and came into the guard chamber, where guards were standing at their ranks, with their muskets upon their shoulders, and snoring as loud as they could. After that he went through several rooms full of gentlemen and ladies, all asleep, some standing, others sitting, and at last he came to the chamber all gilded with gold, where he saw upon a bed, the curtains of which were all open, the finest sight he was ever to behold, a princess, who appeared to be about 15 or 16 of age, and whose bright and, in a manner, resplendent beauty had somewhat in it divine. He approached with trembling and admiration, and fell down before her upon his knees. And now, as the enchantment was at an end, the princess awakened, and looking upon him with her eyes more tender than the first view might seem to admit of. "Is it you, my prince?" she said to him. "You have waited a long while." The prince, charmed with these words, and much more in the manner in which they were spoken, knew not how to show his joy and gratitude. He assured her that he loved her better than he did himself. Their discourse was not well connected. They did weep more than talk, a little eloquence, a great deal of love. He was more at a loss than she, and we need not wonder at it. She had time to think on what she had to say to him, for a very probable, though history mentions nothing of it, that the good fairy, during so long a sleep, had given her very agreeable dreams. In short, they talked 4 hours together, and they said not half of what they thought to say. In the meanwhile, all the palace awakened. Everyone thought upon their particular business, and as all of them were not in love, they were ready to die for the hunger. The chief lady of honor, being as sharp as set as other folks, grew very impatient, and told the princess that supper was served up. The prince helped the princess to rise. She was entirely dressed, and very magnificently, but his royal highness took care not to tell her that she was dressed like his great-grandmother, and had a point band peeping over the high collar. She looked not a bit less charming or beautiful for that. They went into the great hall of looking-glasses, where they supped and were served by the princess's officers. The violins and hautboys played old tunes, but very excellent, though it was now above 100 years since they had played. And after supper, without losing any time, the Lord Almoner married them in the chapel of the castle, and the chief lady of honor drew the curtains. They had but very little sleep. The princess had no occasion, and the prince left her the next morning to return to the city, where his father must needs have been in pain for him. The prince told him that he lost his way in the forest while he was hunting, and that he had lain in a cottage of a coal burner who gave him cheese and brown bread. The king, his father, who was a good man, believed him, but his mother could not be persuaded it was true, and seeing that he went almost every day a-hunting, and that he always had some excuse ready for doing so, though he had just lain out 3 or 4 nights before, she began to suspect that he was married. Indeed, he lived with the princess above 2 whole years, and had by her 2 children, the eldest of which, who was a daughter, was named Morning, and the youngest, who was a son, they called Day, because he was a great deal handsomer and more beautiful than his sister. The queen spoke several times to her son to inform herself after what manner he did pass his time, and that it is in his duty to satisfy her questions. But he never dared to trust her with his secret. He feared her, though he loved her, for she was of the race of ogres, and the king would never have married her had it not been for her vast riches. It was even whispered about the court that she had ogress inclinations, and that whenever she saw little children passing by, she had all the difficulty in the world to avoid falling upon them. And so the prince would never tell her one word. But when the king was dead, which happened about 2 years afterward, he saw himself lord and master, and openly declared his marriage. He went in great ceremony to conduct his queen to the palace. They made a magnificent entry to the capital city, while she were riding between her 2 children. Soon after, the king went to make war with Intercontinabute, his neighbor. He left the government of the kingdom to his queen, the mother, and earnestly recommended to her care of his wife and children. He was obliged to continue his expedition all summer, and as soon as he departed, the queen mother sent her daughter-in-law to a country house among the woods, that she might with more ease gratify her horrible longings. Some few days afterwards she went there herself, and said to her clerk of the kitchen, "I have a mind to eat little Morning for my dinner tomorrow." "Oh, madam," cried the clerk of the kitchen. "I will have it so," replied the queen, and this she spoke in the tone of an ogress who had a strong desire to eat fresh meat. "And we'll eat her with sauce, Robert." The poor man, knowing very well that he must not play tricks with an ogress, took his great knife and went up to little Morning's chamber. She was then 4 years old, and came up to him jumping and laughing, to take him about the neck, and asked him for some sugar candy. Upon which he began to weep. The great knife fell out of his hand, and he went to the backyard, and killed a little lamb, and dressed it with such good sauce that his mistress assured him that she had never eaten anything so good in her life. He had at the same time taken little Morning and carried her to his wife to conceal her in the lodging he had at the bottom of the courtyard. About 8 days afterward, the wicked queen said to the clerk of the kitchen, "I will sup on little Day." He answered not a word, but resolved to cheat her as he had done before, and went to find out little Day, and saw him with a little foil in his hand, which he was fencing with a great monkey. The child being then only 3 years of age, he took him up on his arms and carried him to his wife, that she might conceal him in her chamber along with his sister, and in the room of little Day cooked up a young, very tender kid, which the ogress found to be wonderfully good. This was hitherto all mighty well, but one evening the wicked queen said to the clerk of the kitchen, "I will eat the queen with the same sauce that I had our children with." It was now that poor clerk of the kitchen who despaired in being able to deceive her. The young queen had turned 20, not reckoning the 100 years she had slept, and how to find a yard beast so firm was a puzzle to him. It took then a resolution that he might save his own life and cut the queen's throat, and going up to her chamber with the intent to do so, he put himself into a great fury as he could possibly, and came into the young queen's room with a dagger in his hand. He would not, however, surprise her, but told her, with a great deal of respect, the orders he had received from the queen mother. "Do it! Do it!" she said, stretching at her neck. "Execute your orders, and then I shall go to see my children, my poor children whom I love so much." For she thought them dead ever since they had been taken away without her knowledge. "No, no, madam," cried the poor clerk, all in tears. "You shall not die, and yet you shall see your children again. But you must go home with me to my lodgings, and I've concealed them there, and I shall deceive the queen once more, and giving her your stead a young hind." Upon this he forthwith conducted her to his chamber, where, leaving her to embrace her children and cry along with him, he went and dressed a young hind, which the queen had for her supper, and devoured it with the same appetite as if she had been the young queen. Exceedingly was she delighted with her cruelty, and she had invented a story to tell the king at his return how the mad wolves had eaten up the queen, his wife, and their 2 children. One evening, as she was, according to her custom, rambling around about the courts and yards of the palace to see if she could smell any fresh meat, she heard in a round room little Day crying, for his mamma was going to whip him because he had been naughty, and she heard at the same time little Morning begging pardon for her brother. The ogress presently knew the voice of the queen and her children, and being quite mad that she had been deceived, she commanded next morning, by the break of day, with a most horrible voice which made everybody tremble, that they should bring into the middle of the great court a large tub, which she caused to be filled with toads, vipers, snakes, and all sorts of serpents, in order to have thrown into the queen and her children, the clerk of the kitchen, his wife, and maid, all whom had given orders should be brought there with their hands tied behind them. They were brought out accordingly, and the executioners were just going to throw them into the tub when the king, who was not so soon expected, entered the court on horseback, for he came post, and asked with the utmost astonishment what was the meaning of this horrible spectacle. No one dared to tell him when the ogress, all enraged to see what had happened, threw herself head foremost into the tub, and was instantly devoured by the ugly creatures she had ordered to be thrown into for the others. The king could not but very be sorry, for she was his mother, but he soon comforted himself with his beautiful wife and his pretty children.